Hi, I'm Lynn Walker, immigration partner at Minor and Landis. Thank you for joining us today for our Immigration Update podcast. Over the course of doing these videos and podcasts, we have received numerous inquiries about how to invest in companies in the U.S. and is there an option to get a visa if you do invest in a company? So I can't tell you how excited we are and how fortunate we are to be joined today by our guest, Jeremy Bollington. Jeremy is a franchise consultant with Your Franchise is Waiting, where he works with individuals to help them explore franchise ownership opportunities. And he helps them to work through a detailed discovery process where they can understand whether a franchise works for them and what kind of franchise works for them. So welcome, Jeremy. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got into this field?
Yeah, Lynn. Well, firstly, thank you for having me on the podcast, and I really appreciate that. So I'm sort of I guess an interesting journey to this point. As you can probably tell by my accent, I'm not originally from the U.S., although I am now a citizen. My wife and I came to the U.S. in 1997. I grew up in the U.K. as she did, and I was actually in the banking industry. Worked for a big British bank. I had the chance to come to New York, which was supposed to be for 3 years, and 26 years later, we're still here. And so I had a long career in the banking world. I ran teams. I was kind of a relationship guy. Also had the chance to work in Hong Kong and then back to New York. I got laid off in 2015, and it was sort of a turning point. Really, my youngest child had just gone to college, and I just sort of felt like I should do something different. And so my wife and I kind of investigated business ownership. We also moved from the New Jersey area down to Charleston, South Carolina. And long story short, looked at a lot of different things. Should I start a business? Should I buy a business? And ended up kind of in what I always describe as the sort of the middle ground of a franchise, and actually invested in a couple of franchises where, I describe it as a middle ground because you're still starting a business, but you've got sort of support. You're not on your own. And so that was 2016. I guess about 3 years ago, and we still have one of those two businesses. But I think about 3 years ago, I started a consulting business to help people that were really looking at the similar thing to what I had done, i.e., coming out of the corporate world and wanting to get into business ownership. And so I help people navigate what I describe as the maze of franchising, because there are literally thousands of options out there. And the relevance to E-2 here, I've sort of developed a niche of helping people that are looking to explore ownership of a franchise to support an E-2 visa application, and have worked with a good number of people now over the last 18 months. And for me, it's always kind of fun because, people have that sort of dream to come to America. And my wife and I, did that and have, I think benefited from that over, course of 25 years.
So, Jeremy, thank you for sharing that with us. It's really interesting that you yourself found a way to navigate through the complexity of E-2s, but really more so franchises, which I understand can be, quite challenging. So for our listeners, let's start from the beginning. So what is an E-2 visa and who can apply for one in your experience?
Yep. And so I will caveat my answer with that I'm not a lawyer. So, this is the sort of the business side view of it. So an E-2, as I would describe it, is basically a non-immigrant temporary U.S. visa. And it basically requires the applicant to either invest in an existing business or to start a new business. And then I think in terms of, who can apply for that, there is basically the individual, the applicant has to be a citizen of a country that has a treaty with the US for E-2s. And it's sort of an interesting list. I mean, I think most of the the OECD countries are on that. So you think, UK, France, Germany, etc. In Europe, and places like Australia, New Zealand, Canada, etc.
Excellent. So from a legal perspective, that was all correct. No worries.
Thank you.
I'll act as the immigration attorney on this video. So what are the criteria for a business to support an E-2 visa?
It's sort of interesting because I guess my background in banking, I'm always sort of looking at numbers and precise definitions of things, and probably similar on your side from a legal perspective. But I always think it's interesting with the E2 because it's somewhat gray, and that there is sort of this description of somebody must invest or be in the process of or have invested a substantial amount of capital. People's question is always, well, what does that mean? Nowhere is it sort of really defined, but I think best practice is that it needs to be at least a minimum of 100,000 US. I mean, certainly I think people will say they've seen cases slightly below that, but that's typically my sort of starting point. And ideally, north of that, if somebody is on a limited budget, I'd still much prefer to see the investment amount kind of up closer to 120, 125,000. And obviously if it's above that, then the investment amount is not an issue. The other key sort of criteria, the individual must be coming to the US solely to develop and direct that business. And the business also has to be clearly a for-profit business. It may not be profitable on day one, particularly clearly if it's a startup, it's not going to be, but it has to have the capability of supporting the applicant and his or her family. And if it's a new business, I believe, there's a period of time that they have to get to profitability within.
In your experience, what are the benefits of doing an E2 through a franchise versus the more traditional route of either purchasing an established brick and mortar style company or creating your own company?
That's a great question. And I think, it's sort of interesting. I when I went through my sort of personal journey of looking at businesses, I thought about all three of those options. Obviously, that wasn't to support an E2. That was thinking about it more from perspective of starting a business in the US. To me, if I look at those three options, I think probably the most traditional is somebody buying an existing business, and that can be if you can find the right business at the right price, that can be a great option, because in theory, if it's a well-performing business, it's going to be cash flowing from day one. I think the two big challenges I see there, and I see a lot of people that will come to me that they've been looking on BizBuySell, they've been searching for a business. I'd say probably three issues that I see. One, they may be looking in a certain city or jurisdiction they want to live in. Can they find the right type of business for sale in that market? Two, I think if you're a seller, if you have a great business, are you going to want to sell to somebody who's potentially going to be on a process that's 4 to 6 months, with ultimately no absolute guarantee that they will get their visa. And then third, I think the other issue is due diligence, and doing due diligence on a business. Typically the seller, usually thinks it's worth way more than it actually is. Mm-hmm. I certainly found that when I was looking at some businesses. And so that's always a challenge. So, and again, clearly, a lot of people do go that route and are successful and are able to structure a deal, but it can be a challenge. And I think particularly a challenge if somebody's on a budget and close to that investment amount, as to can they find the right business in that sort of sweet spot of 100, 125,000. The second option, start a business. I think if you're somebody that has run and built a business in let's say you're coming from France or Germany, you've built a successful business, have had that experience of running a business, it's certainly much easier for somebody with that experience to start their own business in the US. It's still somewhat challenging because you're coming to a new culture unless you've had that international business experience. But I think, if somebody doesn't have that experience, the challenge then of, starting a business, creating a brand, creating marketing, doing it all on your own, or paying, ending up actually paying a lot of fees to somebody to do some of the elements for you, I think can be really challenging. And the failure rate of, startup businesses, even in just the US, as, individuals starting businesses in the US without that added complexity of coming to a new country and a new market, is very high. So I think that one's challenging. I think what I sort of like about the franchise world, and it's why I personally went that route, was that, the reality is you're still starting a business because, it doesn't, even in the most successful franchise systems, people fail. And usually that failure is owner operator, in terms of error, not following the system, thinking that they can do it better themselves. In reality, if it's a good franchise system and you follow the system, your chances of success are going to be that much higher. Yes, there's obviously a cost to it. You're paying fees to the franchisor, but in return, you're getting that support system. You're getting the brand, and you're also getting, I think, a huge intangible, which is the other franchisees. I mean, for me as a franchise owner, and certainly owning businesses going through COVID, having that network of other owners that you're not competing with, I mean, they become friends in a lot of cases, that you can pick up the phone to, is just like hugely valuable, I think. And so to me, that's why I always sort of describe franchising as being that middle ground of you're buying into something where you've got that support system that doesn't exist as a small business owner on your own.
Mm-hmm. That's really great information. I typically, when I've worked on E2s, it's been with individuals who create their own businesses. They're successful abroad and they come here and create either a branch or a subsidiary or affiliate. I don't have that much experience with franchises. So I guess that brings us to our next point. How do you choose which franchise is the right one for you? It seems like there are thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of franchises available. How do you know which one is right for you?
Certainly it's a broad landscape. I think at any one time, I think there's about 4,000 to 5,000 companies registered as franchisors, and some, some come and go. You'll see a lot of businesses start with, maybe they've had a corporate business, corporate store, try to franchise, they can't, and they stop. I think the stat is, about 5% of franchises get to 100 either, physical stores or territories. So it gives you a sense of, the number that are able to grow. How do you search? Well, and this is sort of interesting in terms of if you're looking, whether you're looking in the US or you're looking, from, Europe or Asia to support an E2, it's actually quite hard to find real information on individual franchises beyond kind of typically a franchise sales website that the franchisor has that's all bright and shiny and, maybe some sort of headline numbers that grab your attention. And the reason behind that is because they want to talk to people and get you into their sales process. If, and this is a big if they determine that you're qualified. That's tough enough in the US because, you're still having to go through that and talk to a lot of franchisors just to get, kind of even high level information. It's even harder as an E2 candidate because often the moment a franchise development person sees that you're, let's say you're in France, depending on how busy they are, they may or may not even reach out to you. You can fill in the form saying, hey, I'm interested in your franchise. And actually I had that recently with somebody in Germany. He'd been trying to reach a sports franchise and they wouldn't talk to him. And
Mm-hmm.
that can be one of two reasons. I'd say probably 60 to 70, maybe even higher percent of the franchisors out there will not work with E2 candidates. They just think it's too hard, it takes too long, and they worry about the risk of somebody coming, to the US from another country. Can they operate in this country? And so, in terms of choosing the right franchise, one of the things that people like me do is help people filter through that process of not wasting time with those brands that won't work with E2s, but more importantly, working with the individual to really sort of dig into their skill set, their background, their budget, and certainly if their resources are somewhat limited, that budget piece becomes really, really crucial, because not only are they investing in a business, they're coming to a new country, they're going to have costs that they probably don't anticipate. So we spend a lot of time on that, and then really looking at their skill set, what they're comfortable doing. Do they want to be working in the business, or are they looking for something where they can put a manager in place? And then taking all of that information and trying to find the right fits for them in the franchise world within the geography that they're looking at. It seems so many times it's Florida, but that's we have a very good handle now on who has what available in that market. But we work across the country. I've placed people into North Carolina, into Texas. Still seems to be mainly on the southern side of the country, but.
Yeah, it's strange. I think you're probably getting a lot of what we refer to as the snowbirds, people who live in places where the winters are fairly brutal, and they want to be in the U.S. and be able to work, but also be able to enjoy the warmer climate, the warmer temperatures here. So I can understand why you get so many people who want to establish franchises in the southern parts of the U.S. So I guess that brings us to the next question when we're talking about warm. What are the hot franchises right now?
Oh dear. Well, it is funny. Everybody asks me that question. That it doesn't matter what discussion you're having, and I not to avoid the question, but my response is usually like, I don't really care what the hot franchises are. That's not what it's not what I focus on. I mean, if I go back to what we just talked about in terms of process, and everybody is different, and it's sort of going through that methodical process of budget, skill set, needs and wants and things, to determine then what is the right fit for somebody. Although it is funny. Often people will, and this is probably more on my my client base that I would work with in the US. I will see people come and say, "Gee, I read about XYZ. That seems like a really good business," and I'm always nervous when I see franchises growing at very, very fast pace, because it's suddenly they become the hot franchise, and that triggers two or three thoughts in my mind. Is that sustainable? Or is it just a fad? Can the franchisor actually execute on it? Sometimes you'll see stories where a franchise has signed 300-400 locations in a 12, 18, 24 month period. Unless they're backed by a much bigger organization that has franchising experience, and that's not like running the business per se, it's just that experience of onboarding, training franchisees, getting them open, tweaking the system, because if it's a new brand that's just growing like crazy, they're going to have to tweak the system, because things will, they'll discover things that aren't working, to an optimal sense. It is interesting because you will see things grow very rapidly. I'd say, some of the things that have been growing, quickly of late. I think some of the cookie type stores, to me that feels like a fad. You see that often in the food space. You'll see individual sort of kind of subsegments grow rapidly. I'd say where I'm spending more time, both with my E2 and my sort of US clients, is really on service related businesses. They've certainly boomed in the sort of COVID and post-COVID environment, and by that I mean it could be home services. I think a lot of those businesses saw a big boom as people were at home, noticing things that they meant to deal with their house at some point. But I think it's sort of interesting with those businesses because the startup costs tend to be much lower than what people think of as traditional franchises, the bricks and mortar businesses that you see and know the brands, because typically those service businesses are operating out of maybe a small warehouse storage type space, maybe very small office space. You're buying equipment and trucks, and you're hiring technicians to work for you, and so those can be in many ways those can be great options for E2s because you don't have the complexity of real estate, which is a whole separate topic that we might want to touch on, because that's a tough area to navigate.
You've been working with franchises for quite some time now. Have you seen that certain industries, franchises in certain industries, are more challenging or more problematic than others? Are there certain industries that you think an E2 investor should stay away from in terms of owning a franchise?
What I tend to do on the E2 side, and this is definitely different for somebody that's here in the US, but for E2s, and again thinking about franchise where somebody's starting a new location, I think it's very different if somebody's buying an existing mom and pop business, or even buying a resale of a franchise. But where it's a new location, it's very challenging to do the real estate if it's a business that requires a storefront. So let's say a restaurant, a gym, a beauty salon would be the three of the biggest categories there. And the reason it's challenging is, back to that sort of the criteria in terms of sizable investment into a business. For a start, those real estate related businesses that require real estate, the investment amount tends to be much higher because the cost of building out a restaurant, building out a gym can be $300,000, $400,000, $500,000. But even if somebody's got that capital and willing to invest that, the requirement from the E2 is that you can't apply and say, I'm going to, I've paid my franchise fee, I'm coming to the US, and then I'm going to find my location, and it'll be 6 to 9 months after that I'll have nailed down the lease and started build out. You have to have that already secured. And that's really hard to do because it takes a long time. Commercial real estate here in the US just moves very, very slowly. But secondly, it's hard to, as an applicant, to protect yourself in any way because you would be signing, a multi-year lease. The landlord may be nervous to do that because you're coming without a credit history, probably in the US. And the landlord doesn't have that certainty that you're going to get the visa approved. And so for all of those reasons, I think starting a new kind of franchise that requires physical bricks and mortar storefront is just very challenging. And I tend to steer away from that. I think the other element that can be in a totally different direction that can be challenging for somebody coming to the US is a business that requires kind of typically the owner at the outset to be kind of chief sales person, particularly if that's sales into the B2B, the business world, unless that individual has had, broad kind of international business development and sales experience, because, typically it could be both language, culture, and just that comfort with calling and selling in the US. And again, I can say from personal experience, when I first came to the US as a banking kind of sales relationship guy, it took a while to adapt to the culture, and there wasn't any language issue. It was just, culturally just very, very different. So I'd say those would be the big two that I would sort of steer clear of if, again, depending on the individual.
What were some of the things that you found challenging? I would assume possibly it was the lack of connections. Like it can be hard if you don't have connections to sell to people. But what did you find about the culture that was challenging?
Reflecting back, God, it was a long time ago now, 25 years ago, but there's probably two things. I think one was sort of just, I guess it's somewhat cultural, and that was in the UK, the typical sort of start of a meeting would be 10 minutes, like chat about, I don't know, the weather, the cricket, the soccer, the kids, whatever. I mean, depending on how long you've known somebody. Whereas and some of this might have been the sort of positioning of the bank I was with at that time. We didn't, we were not like a top bank to any of these clients. So it could well have been, you got 30 minutes, come pitch your stuff. But that, I think after a couple of weeks, realizing like, okay, just need to get down to, start the meeting with like, here's the agenda. Let's get on with it. So that was sort of, and I still think that's some of that. I think that's still there today, probably. But and then I think the other element was just that the point about relationships, which I think is a good one that you bring up there, because again, if tying that sort of back to if you're starting a business in the US, and this isn't franchise specific. In fact, actually, I think one of the things that the franchise world helps with is they're kind of typically they're proven marketing systems and ways to the playbook of here's how you start out. And I sort of always think about if you're starting that business on your own, again, unless you've done it successfully going into other markets, other countries, I just think that's really, really challenging. I see often I'll see people come and set up often tends to be things like marketing, digital marketing type businesses. I can only imagine how tough that is unless somebody's already got a pre-existing network to start going and knocking on doors to build business.
Jeremy, with all of your experience, being an immigrant yourself, being a business owner, having to learn the ropes about the culture and also just how to navigate through the process of owning and finding the right franchise for yourself. What advice would you offer to someone who's interested in coming to the US through the E-2 process, or just advice to any new immigrant who arrives in the US and is, looking to work? What advice would you have?
Yep. Well, I think I'd probably break that into two elements. If it's somebody just, coming to work in the US, or if somebody's invested in a business and they're launching that business, I think it's, accept that you're coming into a different culture and try to, adapt and bend to that as quickly as you can, but without losing. And people often joke, it's like, gee, you got that British accent, you kind of use that so don't lose everything that that you're bringing and your experiences and that. But I think it's very like, don't fight the culture. And that was my back to my example of like, just start the meeting quickly, because you had a certain amount of time, and if you wasted half of that on chit chat, you weren't going to get an extra 10-15 minutes at the end of the meeting to catch it up. I think if somebody's kind of looking at and has made that decision to seek an E-2, and they're uncertain about whether to start their own business or want to explore franchising, I think either route that you're going, I would say it's engage professionals. The number of times I come across people that have perhaps been declined because they didn't use an immigration attorney, maybe didn't use somebody to help them write their business plan. You can have the greatest business in the world and be ready to roll. But, if you don't get approved, that it's all for now. So I think it's engage those professionals. And if you're looking at, if you've made that decision that you want to explore what the options are on the franchise side, it's engage somebody, like me to help you through, because as we talked about earlier, it's hard to explore individual franchise options on your own, because it's just hard to engage with the right franchisors.
I love that advice. Not just to work with professionals. The E-2 is probably one of the most complex visa processes that I've worked on. I mean, you really need to have someone write your business plan. You need to have someone help you with marketing. You definitely need legal help, not just from an immigration attorney, but also for contracts. If you're talking about a franchise, you need someone who can help you navigate that, such as yourself. You also need an accountant. I'm sometimes amazed at people who try to start the process, are halfway through and realize I'm running up against a barrier. And you look at what they've done, and they do have a great idea, but they've started the whole process the wrong way. And it takes so much more time, effort, expense to undo everything that's wrong and restart it. So that's wonderful advice. I guess the next question would be, so let's say someone wants to engage you to help them navigate through the franchise process. How do you get paid? What are your fees?
Yep. So the good news for the E2 candidate is that actually the franchise consultant broker model is actually very similar to what we would call buyer's agent in real estate, or even executive search, in that we have a network of 400 to 500 franchisors, again, not all of which will work with E2s, but we're part of a network where those franchisors carve out part of their marketing budget to pay a referral commission to somebody like me if I bring them a candidate who ultimately goes through the due diligence process and becomes a franchise owner. The sort of caveat with E2 candidates is that's a longer process, because typically the franchisor doesn't sort of recognize them as a full-blown franchisee until they have their E2 visa. But I get paid at that point. So my services to somebody looking at exploring ownership from an E2 perspective are free. What I do, obviously, is I early on I work with somebody to qualify, are they a serious candidate, or are they just kicking tires? I'm candidly, we go through that initial process and decide, does it make sense for the two of us to work together to work through what can be a 6 to 9 month process from first conversation to as for the timeline for E2, depending on which country they're coming from.
And so, final question, Jeremy. How do people contact you if they want to engage your services?
So the easiest way to get in touch with me is through our website, www.yourfranchiseiswaiting.com, and hopefully we can attach a link. As you go to that website, you'll see a services section and a specific tab for E2 services. Just take a look at that. It's got hopefully some helpful information there as well, and you can schedule a consultation with me through there. It goes directly to my calendar.
Jeremy, thank you so much for sharing your insight, your personal experience, and your history with immigration with us. I think your own journey has provided you with so much understanding of the process and compassion for those who are wanting to come to the U.S. and invest in the country. And you've done it yourself, so you know what it takes to get the visa approved. I can't thank you enough for joining us. And I want to thank our listeners for joining us as well. If you have any questions, please feel free to send us a message through LinkedIn. If they are with regard to the E-2 and you'd like to connect with Jeremy, we will have his contact information available as well in the text of the video as well as in our posts. Thank you once again for joining us.
Thank you, Lynn.